Dennis Mundy here with my co-host Phil Goldberg. Our guest today, Naveed Hameed. Wonderful stuff about Sufism. I learned a lot, and it's a religion of practice more than just doctrine. So, did you know much about Sufism? Have you ever been to a Sufi temple before, anything like that?
I was at one, and I know Sufis. I know some Sufi teachers, sheikhs, and I've encountered them as well in interfaith gatherings and so forth. But I think my first exposure to Sufism was when I was, really young and just sort of exploring mysticism and all the esoteric teachings, and I came across, I don't even remember how or where, but I remember, reading about it and just the discovery that it existed was a revelation. Just as it was, in those days, it was a revelation to discover that there was something called Kabbalah, and there were Christian mystics.
Right.
I mean, because that's not what we were familiar with. And whatever I knew about Islam, it didn't include these incredible Sufi saints and mystics that are, very similar to the esoteric traditions and all the other religions.
Yeah, that was, Phil, very eye-opening for me as well. I grew up, Catholic, and I had no idea that Christianity had a tradition of mysticism, the monks and the meditation, and Thomas Merton. I had no exposure to that, the Desert Fathers, and then Judaism. I had never heard of the Kabbalah, and like you said, Sufi. So it seems like almost every religion, every tradition has some element of mysticism, of internal development. And I've never been to a Sufi temple. I'd like to go. There's a gentleman I met, Llewellyn von Lee. Hopefully we'll have him on the show sometime, who's an American but runs the Golden Sufi Center in near San Francisco, and fascinating. And I think his tradition of Sufism isn't the dancing and all. It's more meditative. It's more inward. So, like she said, there's different traditions of it. But I guess the first exposure, the first time I ever heard about it or read about it, it were these whirling dervishes, people that would go into these ecstatic states. And I've never seen that in person. I'd love to. And
I have, actually. I was at two different Parliament of World Religions, and at every one of them, they have a sort of concluding evening of music and dance from all the world's different traditions. And in both instances, the whirling dervishes were like a very a sort of culminating and very popular feature of the program. It's beautiful to watch, and the music is haunting and gorgeous.
I would love to actually do it, have the experience of being a whirling dervish, but I get dizzy very easily, so I don't know. It'll happen with me. But
you might have to take your seasick medication.
Exactly. Not to be a tree hugger or anything, Phil, but wouldn't it be great if all the religions, all the belief systems of the world learned from each other, shared with each other, instead of we're frightened that their traditions would be trampled upon or perverted or whatever. So we have religions and spiritual groups always battling, always being frightened of other spiritual groups and religions, that if they just shared it. And I think there's a lot of that goes on now, the sharing part of it.
Much.
So hopefully that will grow.
It's a very different world than it used to be, and we've had people on who are very active in the interfaith world. If people haven't heard our interview with Paul Chaffee and with Gwyn Giebord and other people who are very active in the interfaith world and the interspiritual world, Mirabai Starr and Kurt Johnson and others have been on the show. There's a lot of that now, especially with young people and in urban areas. When people are exposed to other people, if you're at all open-minded, you don't feel a threat, you feel a curiosity, and you want to learn from each other. And that's going on at a much greater rate than ever before. There's a long way to go, of course, but there is that, and there's an educational factor. I mean, I live in L.A. And here you are more likely to know that there is such a thing as Sufism, and there's different areas and different aspects of Islam. Whereas if you live in a more homogeneous culture, you may not be exposed to it.
Right. I'd love to learn more. I have a friend who's actually a Lubavitch rabbi, and I remember one time he asked if he could come into my office. He was traveling, and and do his prayer, whatever prayer he was doing that time of the day, and there was a certain amount of movement and rocking and back and forth,
Mm,
and he
mm.
explained it a little bit to me, why that was part of the prayer. But I'd love to learn more about that,
Yeah,
and see the difference and similarities between different techniques of prayer and meditation, from tradition to tradition, because
and
there's
that
definitely
move.
similarities. Yeah.
Yes, and that movement piece is because people like you and me our uh, core spiritual practice has been silent meditation,
Hmm.
but there are other practices where movement is encouraged, and in some cases it's ritualized. So what you experience with the Rebbe, Jews call davening, and probably that's what he was doing. It'd be
Hmm.
the sort of rocking back and
Racking
forth.
back and forth. Yeah.
Yeah, and Sufis have these practices of movement, standing and sitting that go along with chanting and music. Obviously, we're familiar with kirtan and Buddhist chanting. In some cases, there's movement associated with it. Sometimes it's ritualized. Sometimes it's just free form. So, there's something about the integration of the body and the voice and the inner state that's probably very valuable when taught right and practiced right.
Right. And I think if we look carefully, every tradition has that, and there's probably more of
Yeah.
these meditative technologies, these spiritual technologies than we're familiar with. And so we'll come again, across more and more. The other thing, you did pose to her the question, and it was interesting about how Sufism is accepted by the larger body of by traditional uh, Islamic folk.
Yeah.
And yeah, it sounded like she didn't want to get into it too much, but apparently in countries like Iran now and all, I don't know how openly they can practice. The Baha'i
Yeah.
have the same issues in
Yeah.
a number of Middle Eastern
And
countries.
and I gather in Pakistan there's some issues,
Hmm.
with the treatment of Sufis, and I don't know what it's like in the Arabic cultures,
Hmm.
but they tend to some of the Arab cultures tend to be very strict about um, what they consider the only acceptable way to
Right.
to practice, the only acceptable belief system, and so there's not only discrimination against the Christians and Jews, but other Muslims
Right.
who are not of the sort of majority or the branch of Islam that's in power. So there's often more problem within religions, than there is across them.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting. Every
Yeah,
religion seems,
there's a certain.
and every spiritual group seems to have their fundamentalists, and those folks are usually not as open to
Yeah,
interpretation or
orthodoxy.
different. Yeah, orthodoxy. That it's this is not even
Yeah,
religions, but also even different spiritual groups are like that. That
that's
this is
right. That's right.
everybody feels that
And
they
some
have
of it,
the way. Yeah.
and they have the right way, and they have to be protective of it and keep it pure in the way they see purity. But there's another element to this that I'm sure sociologists and historians look at, which is we've talked about these esoteric groups being lesser known and often oppressed or by the majority of religion. But, in the esoteric traditions, in the mystical traditions, the whole point is you don't need a mediator
Hmm.
to mediate between you, the individual, and your experience and the divine.
Right.
There are these methods for having your inner experience as individuals, direct experience. And so that is often seen as a threat to the power structure of a religion, because if you're dependent on the priesthood,
right. Don't let anybody get too independent, because
right,
if they do, then they're not dependent upon us, and if they're not dependent upon us, what are we useful for? And I think
right.
that's a
That's
big,
I
big
mean that's why the
issue.
Catholic Church didn't like Protestants.
Yeah,
Who were that's what the whole Protestant Reformation was about.
right. Fascinating stuff. Well, hopefully we'll have another Sufi on, and I'd
Yeah,
like to hear more about it and hear it from different angles and different perspectives. But I really enjoyed Naheed. I felt I learned quite a bit from her today.
yeah, it's
Uh,
great.
uh,
Okay,
all right. All the
next
best.
time.
Next time.
Bye.